It was a Tuesday morning soaked in the kind of rain that clings to windows like unanswered questions, when Harold found her handwriting in a book she never read. He'd lived in the seaside town for 40 years, passed that little second-hand bookshop more times than he could count, and yet, until that day, never once stepped inside. The book wasn't remarkable, just an old novel with faded edges. But tucked between page 147 and 48, folded carefully like a secret not ready to be buried, was a letter, written in a hand he hadn't seen since the funeral. Welcome to Echoes of Kindness, where even silence has a story, and sometimes the past waits in the most unexpected places. Who had she written it for, and why hide it there? Stay with us until the end, because what Harold discovers next might just change the way you see love and memory. Harold didn't look like a man you'd write a story about. He blended into the landscape of the seaside town like an old bench that no one really noticed, but everyone would miss if it were gone. Tall, with shoulders that once carried ladders and heavy cables, now slightly hunched as if he were leaning into time itself. His days moved slowly, deliberately, much like the tide that brushed the worn stones of the promenade he walked every morning at 7:30, rain or shine. Since Eleanor passed away, the house had grown quieter. Not just empty, quiet, as though something had been gently switched off, and Harold didn't quite know how to turn it back on. He still boiled water in the old kettle she refused to replace, still lined the bookshelf with fresh tulips from the Tuesday market, because she loved the color yellow, even though it never suited their living room. There was a softness to the way he moved around the house, like a man rehearsing for someone who would never return. He would often pause at the doorway to her reading nook, fingers grazing the edges of her old books, arranged not by title or author, but by how they made her feel. She once said that she didn't trust people who gave away books too easily. Stories should stay where they were loved, she told him once, brushing dust from a forgotten novel, as if it were something sacred. They never had children, not by choice, but by quiet surrender. After years of hospital visits, whispers behind clinic doors, and Eleanor's brave smiles at family gatherings, they learned to build a different kind of life. A smaller one, perhaps, but full of rituals no one else would see. The way she hummed Debussy while baking, the creak in the floorboard that made her laugh every time he tripped on it, the notes she'd leave tucked in his coat pocket and on cold days. Wear your scarf, the wind has teeth. Today. Harold had always been a man of facts. He worked for the local electric board for over 30 years, memorizing switchboards and circuit maps the way others remember football scores. But Eleanor, she taught literature, poetry. She felt everything too deeply and carried it quietly. Harold used to watch her read as if she were speaking to the pages. Their love wasn't cinematic. It didn't require grand gestures. It would built in the silences, in the habits, in the staying. But even in that constancy, there were things unsaid. There had always been a shadow behind Eleanor's eyes in autumn, a quiet hush that didn't belong to Harold, no matter how gently he tried to reach it. He never asked, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some stories, she said, are meant to be folded away, like letters that were never posted. And yet here he was, years later, holding one of those letters in his hand. Perhaps that was why it shook him so deeply. Not because of jealousy or betrayal, but because it proved there was a part of her he had never been allowed to hold. A secret not of infidelity, but of grief, of goodbye. And that knowing, it carved something out of him, something that had been whole for decades. Harold didn't cry that morning in the bookshop, but he held the letter as though it were made of glass. Later, he would sit in the kitchen they once shared, the light spilling through the half-drawn curtains, and he would reread her words not as a confession, but as a final act of trust. He made no vow aloud. But somewhere between the silence, in the tea cooling in his cup, a quiet promise stirred, to understand what she never said, and perhaps to forgive the past neither of them could rewrite. It took Harold a moment to register what he was holding. The paper was thin, almost translucent, the kind you'd find in old stationery boxes or tucked away in desk drawers that hadn't been opened in years. Time had browned its edges and softened its corners. But what startled him most was the handwriting. It was hers. There was a peculiar kind of stillness that settled in the shop. Not silence exactly, he could still hear the soft tap of rain against the window, the faint creak of a floorboard somewhere behind the counter. But everything inside Harold paused, as if his body knew this moment would rearrange something permanent. He unfolded the page carefully. The ink had bled in places, water-warped and worn by age or perhaps something else. A corner smudged faintly with what might have been a tear, or rain, or regret. The first line was simple. To the man I never quite forgot. Harold's breath caught. He looked around instinctively, as though the world might confirm what he was seeing or challenge it. But the shop remained indifferent. Books lined the walls in quiet witness. The old woman behind the counter, someone he'd never met, continued scribbling in a ledger with a chewed pencil, humming tunelessly. The rest of the letter unfolded in a voice he both knew intimately and suddenly realized he hadn't fully understood. It wasn't addressed to him. That was clear. The tone, the tenderness, the ache behind each sentence, it belonged to someone else, someone who came before him. She spoke of waiting, of sitting on a train platform in the winter of '66, of a boy who played piano with calloused fingers and promised her Paris in spring. She wrote of long walks and half-finished poems, of parting without closure. You told me to wait, and I did. I waited too long, and then I stopped. I'm sorry. Nowhere in the letter did she mention Harold, and yet her absence of him was its own presence. He read it once, then again. His fingers trembled, not from anger, but from the delicate weight of it all. How a single page could reshape decades of certainty. He didn't feel betrayed. That would have been simpler. What he felt was something murkier, a kind of mourning for a story he never got to know. He asked the shopkeeper where the book had come from. She frowned, flipping back a few pages in her notebook. Donations, she said. A batch from the old school library, I think. Or was it the council clearance from the village hall? Hard to say. He thanked her, left with the book in hand, and walked home through the rain without noticing it. That night, he didn't make tea, didn't play his usual Brahms vinyl. Instead, he sat at the kitchen table, letter unfolded before him, and stared at Eleanor's handwriting as if he could reach through it, speak to the version of her who had written those words. What startled him most was not the letter itself, but that she'd kept it. For all her meticulous tidiness, her habit of throwing out shopping lists from 2 days ago, she had kept this. Hidden in a book she never mentioned, in a part of the shelf she rarely touched. She hadn't sent it, hadn't burned it. She tucked it away. That choice, it meant something. He just didn't know what yet. The next morning, Harold did something he hadn't done in years. He climbed the attic stairs. Eleanor's boxes were still up there, carefully labeled, untouched since the spring cleaning of '09. He opened the one marked Old School Books, EC. Inside, yellowed copies of Bronte, a first edition Auden, a small tin of pressed flowers, and more bookmarks than any one person could reasonably need, but no more letters. Still, he began to look. Night after night, he'd return to her shelf, pulling out books at random, searching. He wasn't sure what for. Another note, a name, a photograph, something that would give context, some clue about the man in the letter, or how close she had come to choosing another life. But the pages remained silent. Her past had folded itself neatly away, as she had always done, with grace and care, and just enough mystery to leave him wondering. And yet, things had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. He began to dream about her again, not the Eleanor he knew at 72, but the one from before him, the one who waited at train stations, who wrote unsent letters, who laughed too freely and forgave too easily. He dreamt of her as a girl, alive with longing, unfinished, unguarded. It hurt, and still it healed something too. In the weeks that followed, he found himself paying closer attention to the details she'd loved. He started watering the rosemary she'd once given up on. He reread her favorite Hardy poems, even the ones he used to say were too melancholy for a Tuesday. He left a light on in her reading corner at dusk just because. But there was something else too. The letter had done more than stir memory. It had opened a door he hadn't known was still closed. Because if Eleanor had once loved someone else deeply, before him, and still chosen to stay, then perhaps love wasn't about erasing the past. It was about holding space for it, letting it exist, and choosing, every day in spite of what came before. He didn't know who the man in the letter was. Perhaps he never would. But Harold had made a decision. He would return the book. And he would not keep the letter. The story didn't belong to him alone. It had lived long before he entered it, and now maybe it needed to keep living somewhere else, with someone else. And so one gray morning, a month after that rainy Tuesday, Harold walked back into the bookshop. The bell above the door rang just as it had before. The shopkeeper looked up. "I'd like to put this back," he said quietly, handing over the book. She raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure?" Harold smiled softly as if something heavy had finally settled inside him. "Yes, some stories need to find their own readers." He didn't tell her about the letter, about what it had meant, about the days he'd spent unraveling its echoes. But as he left, he paused at the shelf marked "Everyone Deserves a New Beginning," and gently, almost reverently, placed the book where someone else might find it. And with that small act, something within him shifted again. Because sometimes the hardest part of love isn't holding on. It's letting go without resentment, and understanding finally that you were never meant to be the only chapter. The book was gone now, left deliberately, almost ritualistically, on the shelf marked, "Everyone Deserves a New Beginning." But the letter had not left him. If anything, its absence echoed louder than its presence. Each morning after, Harold found himself drifting through routines with a subtle but growing disquiet. He would water the garden too early or too late, forget the milk, oversteep his tea. His hands, once so steady, trembled slightly when he tried to tie his shoelaces. These were not the symptoms of age. They were signs of distraction, of something churning quietly beneath the surface. He had let the letter go, yes, but he had not let go of the question it left behind. Who had Eleanor been before she became his? It was a question he had never dared to ask her in life. Their marriage had been founded on mutual care, a kind of gentle deference that respected boundaries rather than tested them. There were entire chapters of her life they had both silently agreed not to open, not because they were hiding, but because their love had always seemed enough without knowing everything. But now he wasn't so sure. Some nights he would sit in her reading chair, still faintly perfumed with lavender, and let the silence stretch. The clock would tick. The radiator would hum, and somewhere between midnight and the early breath of dawn, he would imagine her younger self, the woman who wrote that letter, who stood in the cold at a train station, waiting for someone else. He started to reread her books with a different eye, not for plot or prose, but for margin notes, highlights, forgotten bookmarks. He treated them like archaeological sites, digging through metaphors and underlined phrases for traces of the woman he had never quite touched. It was in her copy of A Room with a View that he found something new, a faded bus ticket tucked between pages 78 and 79. One way, dated January 1967, destination, Brighton. It wasn't conclusive, not really, but it was enough to reignite the ache. He began visiting the library archives, tracing her name through old-school records and yearbooks. He found a photograph, Eleanor at 23, standing at the edge of a teacher's conference, her smile caught between uncertainty and grace. It startled him how familiar and unfamiliar she looked. The same posture, the same tilt of the head, but the eyes, there was something in the eyes he'd never seen in their years together. Longing, perhaps, or unfinished hope. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, he found a picture he couldn't explain. A Polaroid tucked behind a Christmas card from 1975. It showed Eleanor sitting on a stone bench near the sea, her hand resting on the arm of a man with dark hair. The man was half turned away, blurred slightly, but what unnerved Harold was not the man's presence. It was the way Eleanor looked at him. Not love, not exactly, but something else, something quieter, like recognition. He turned the photo over. On the back, written in the same script as the letter. Only once, Brighton. That word again, the name Brighton. Once just a seaside town 2 hours away, now pulsed like a quiet drumbeat in his mind. He considered going, just to see, just to understand. But the thought unsettled him. What would he be looking for? The man, a memory, some part of Eleanor that had been hidden even from herself? He didn't know. Instead, he began withdrawing. Not dramatically, just enough that the neighbors stopped trying to chat. That his sister stopped inviting him over for Sunday roast. That the local grocer started asking if everything was all right in a voice that said he already knew it wasn't. Grief had made him quiet before. But this was different. This was doubt. And doubt, Harold discovered, was lonelier than grief. He started walking at odd hours, midnight strolls, dawn wanderings, through empty streets and along the promenade where the sea wind whipped hard against his coat. Sometimes he thought he saw her, a flicker of a woman with a red scarf just turning the corner. But it was never her. Of course not. Still, the not knowing gnawed at him. The idea that even in their closeness, there had been a locked door she never opened for him. He grew sharper with himself. Cross at small things. He once snapped at a boy in the shop for running too loudly, then immediately felt the flush of shame crawl up his neck. Was this who he was becoming? One rainy evening, as the wind howled like some old creature at the door, he sat staring at the same page of a book for over an hour. The fire had gone out, the room was dim, and suddenly he said aloud, to no one, to her maybe, or perhaps to the memory of her. Why didn't you tell me? His voice cracked at the end, not from anger, but from exhaustion, because what he feared most was not that she had loved someone else. It was that she had been in pain and hadn't let him carry it with her. That was the quiet heartbreak, that he had not been invited into her sorrow, that some corner of her had remained untouched by their years, unreachable even as she lay beside him. And then came the guilt. Had he made it hard for her to speak? Had his love, steady, dependable, safe, also been a kind of quiet demand for silence? Had she sensed, in his unspoken rules and unshakable routines, that her past would be unwelcome? The questions tightened around his ribs like a belt. It wasn't that he regretted their life. No, it had been a good life, a kind one. But perhaps it had also been incomplete. He began writing in a small notebook Eleanor had once gifted him. It had remained blank for years, tucked in the drawer beneath the phone. Now, each evening he filled a page, not with answers, but with memories, moments, glimpses, things he feared he'd forget. The way her fingers curled when she slept, the humming when she cooked, the way she always paused before opening a letter, as though the paper itself might speak. Sometimes he wrote letters to her, not to confront, but to continue. Was he kind to you? Did you ever go to Paris after all? I forgive you even if I don't understand you. One night he wrote something he hadn't dared think until then. Maybe love isn't about being the whole story. Maybe it's about being the chapter someone chooses to stay in. The act of writing softened something in him, but it did not erase the ache. It only gave it shape. He still hadn't told anyone, not his sister, not the vicar, not even the old shopkeeper who now greeted him with a sad smile and never asked why he kept walking past the new arrival's shelf without stopping. The letter had passed through him like a wind through trees, unseen but altering everything it touched. And now he stood somewhere in between past and present, between knowing and not knowing, between Eleanor, the woman he loved, and Eleanor, the girl who once waited on a platform and chose silence instead of goodbye. It wasn't over, not yet. The ache had more to say. And Harold, though tired, though afraid, was finally ready to listen. Harold hadn't intended to go. The idea had been haunting the back of his mind like a tide that kept nudging the same shore, but he'd always managed to find reasons to stay. Too far, too late, too uncertain. But one quiet Thursday morning, with a thin mist curling over the hedges and the sound of gulls crying in the distance, something shifted. He buttoned his coat, packed the letter into his pocket, and boarded the early train to Brighton. The journey felt longer than it should have, not in miles but in meaning. Each passing field blurred by the window carried with it a weight Harold couldn't name. He watched the sky brighten slowly, as if the world itself was unsure about revealing too much too soon. He arrived just past midday. Brighton was much the same as he remembered it from long-ago day trips with Eleanor. The briny scent of the sea, the flocks of pigeons near the pier, the faint music from old arcades drifting like smoke. But now it all felt muted, like looking at something beloved through glass. He didn't have a destination, only a direction. He wandered, past cafes and narrow streets, past bookshops that reminded him too much of that first letter. And then, quite suddenly, he stopped. There it was, the bench from the photo. It hadn't changed much, The stone was still chipped in the corner. The view still opened out to the graying sea. It was quiet there, wind-whipped and nearly deserted. Harold sat down slowly, taking in the exact angle from which the photograph had been taken. He took out the picture again, just to be sure. Same place, same stillness. The woman in the photo had been younger, lighter, but it was undeniably Eleanor. Her expression in the picture was strange. Not quite joyful, not quite sunken, almost as though she knew even then that the moment would have to live on without her. He sat there for a long while. Let the sea speak around him. Let the wind press questions he didn't yet have answers for. Then someone spoke. "You're sitting in my spot." Harold turned. An older man stood beside the bench, wool coat flapping in the breeze. His voice was polite but dry, familiar somehow. Harold shifted. "Sorry, I didn't know it was taken." "It usually isn't, not at this hour. But then you're not from here, are you?" There was something in the man's gaze that held Harold for a beat too long, something knowing. "No," Harold admitted, "just passing through." The man nodded, then sat beside him anyway. Silence stretched between them, filled with the sea and seagulls, and a quiet tension neither of them named. Finally, Harold asked, "Did you know her?" The man didn't look surprised. "Eleanor? Yes, a long time ago." He didn't ask who Harold was. Perhaps he already knew, or perhaps it no longer mattered. "She waited here once," the man continued, "every Thursday for nearly 3 months. Said she liked the way the waves sounded against the stones. I think she hoped I'd come back." "Did you?" "Not in time," Harold said nothing. The man pulled something from his coat pocket, a book, worn, weathered. He held it out. "She left this with me the last day we saw each other. Told me to keep it until it stopped hurting." Harold took it gently. The cover was soft leather, cracked with age. Inside the front page in Eleanor's handwriting, "Some chapters we don't get to finish, but that doesn't mean they weren't worth writing." His throat tightened. "Why didn't she tell me?" The man hesitated, then softly, "Because you were the chapter she chose, not the one she mourned." Harold closed the book. For a long time they sat in silence. Two men with years between them. Two endings for the same beginning. And for the first time in weeks, Harold didn't feel lost. Just human. And maybe that was enough. But as they sat, the man reached once more into his coat and produced a second envelope, sealed, yellowed, and addressed in Eleanor's hand, to Harold. "She asked me to give you this," the man said. "She wrote it after your first wedding anniversary. I never knew why she didn't send it." Harold took it with reverence. The envelope trembled in his hands. He opened it slowly, unfolding the letter as if unwrapping a breath frozen in time. "My dearest Harold, there is something I've carried with me since before we met. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I never knew how to name it without risking what we have. You have given me more peace than I thought myself worthy of. You never asked for my before. You only ever cared for my now. And yet, that kindness, it made me want to give you everything, even the pieces of me I'd hoped would quietly disappear. There was someone once, before you. He never hurt me, not in the ways you might imagine, but he left me waiting for too long, until I stopped being who I was when he first met me. And when I met you, I didn't want to be that girl again. I wanted to be someone new, someone who chose joy. But we don't erase what shapes us, do we? We carry it in silence or in ink, in serious sighs or in letters never sent. I kept one. Not because I was holding on, but because I needed to remember that even the unfinished can still be beautiful. If you ever find this, it means you found the book. It means you looked where I never asked you to look. And I want you to know you were never second. You were the life I never thought I'd earn. Love you always, Eleanor. Harold folded the letter with trembling hands. The sea, ever constant, continued its rhythm behind them. The wind pressed soft against his collar. The sky remained silent, as though it too were listening. He felt something shift aboard him, a pressure he'd carried for weeks, for years perhaps, beginning to ease. Not because the pain had gone, but because now it had somewhere to rest. The man beside him rose. "I should go," he said. "I have nothing else," she left. Harold looked up. "You had more of her past. I had more of her future. I think we were both lucky." The man gave a sad smile. Yes, we were. And then he was gone, coat disappearing into the sea mist, leaving Harold alone with the waves, the book, and the letter. He didn't rush to leave. He sat for hours, letting the weight of everything find its place inside him. The guilt, the love, the questions, the answers. It no longer mattered that he hadn't known every part of her. What mattered now was what she'd chosen to share, and what he'd chosen to keep alive. As dusk began to fall, Harold placed the book gently on the bench and stood. He no longer needed to carry it. Some stories are not meant to be owned. They're meant to be remembered. And in the remembering, made whole. Weeks passed. Not dramatically, not with sweeping changes or sudden transformations, but in the way time often does when something has quietly shifted inside. The world continued around Harold as it always had, the tides coming and going, the seagulls circling overhead, the neighbors tending their hedges, and the postman dropping letters through the same old slot. But within him, there was a new stillness, one not born of absence, but of understanding. Grief hadn't left him. It never truly does. But it had softened its shape. It no longer clung like fog in the chest. Instead, it curled gently in the corners of his home, on the windowsill where Eleanor's favorite plant still grew, in the faint scent of her perfume that lingered on the collar of her coat, which he couldn't quite bring himself to move. He resumed the rituals he once shared with her, not out of habit, but as small acts of remembering. He trimmed the rose bushes she used to speak to as if they might answer. He made a pot of tea at 4, poured a second cup, and placed it across from him on the kitchen table, not expecting anything but not ready to let go of the shape she left behind. And in the evenings when the sea breeze pressed gently through the curtains, he lit the lamp beside her reading chair and let it glow until the last page of dusk turned to night. The letter remained in the drawer beside his bed, not hidden but held, like a seashell one returns to, not for what it says but for what it reminds them of. He no longer looked for more secrets. That part of the journey had ended. Now he began something else, a quiet tending of memory, a soft honoring of the incomplete. He wrote often, not with purpose, but with presence. Fragments mostly, reflections, descriptions of the sky, the curl of a robin's wing, the way silence feels heavier after rain. In one entry he wrote, "Some stories don't need to be finished to be enough. Some hearts don't need to be fully known to be wholly loved." There was a gentleness in him now that hadn't been there before. Not because he loved Eleanor more, but because he finally understood that she, like all of us, had been many things. And loving her meant loving all of her, even the parts that never made their way into words. Sometimes he thought of the man from the bench. He wondered what memories he carried, what he had let go of, what he still held close. But he didn't need answers anymore. The ache had found its resting place. And in its stead, there was room again for warmth, for breath, for something that resembled peace. And then, one ordinary morning, sunlight skimming the garden fence, kettle hissing on the hob, Harold did something he hadn't done in years. He began a letter, not to Eleanor, but to whoever might one day find the book. He wrote, "If you've opened this, it means the story found you. Perhaps like me, you were looking for something you didn't know how to name. Or maybe something found you first. A letter, a name, a silence too heavy to ignore. Whatever it is, know this. You are not alone in the wondering. Sometimes love isn't the chapter we expected. It's the one that stayed even after the last page turned." He folded it carefully and tucked it inside the back cover of Eleanor's novel, the one he had once carried to Brighton and left behind. The book had returned to him unexpectedly, posted weeks later with no return address. But now he knew what to do. That afternoon, he walked to the small second-hand bookshop 2 streets down, the one Eleanor used to visit, where the bell above the door still chimed like an old friend's voice. He placed the book gently on the shelf marked, "For New Beginnings." And this time he smiled, not because he was letting go, but because he was giving something forward. A piece of her, a piece of him, a story unfinished, but ready to begin again in someone else's hands. Outside, the sea was beginning to sing, and somewhere far beyond what he could see, the pages began to turn. Sometimes the deepest kind of love is simply the one that stays, even when we never hear the full story. If this tale reminded you of someone you have quietly carried, comment 1 and let that memory breathe a little today. And if you find this story meaningful, please subscribe to the channel for more. Don't forget to check out the video currently on your screen. You won't want to miss it. See you in the next one.